The Nadir of Race Relations. This is the fifth and last video of our Reconstruction unit. We will examine the effects of black codes, sharecropping, and debt peonage in African Americans. Let's start by reviewing our vocabulary in context. The term nadir means the lowest point, rock bottom, all-time low, or just a point of greatest adversity or despair. For example, when Clark got fired and was unable to find another job, he realized his professional life was at its nadir. The nadir, or lowest point of race relations in the United States, took place after 1877 until the early 20th century. With the end of Reconstruction in 1877, the federal government withdrew from the South, and African Americans were systemically deprived of their basic political and civil rights. Before the Civil War, the Dred Scott decision had declared that African Americans were not citizens, just property. The situation of African Americans began to change as Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed slaves in the Confederacy in 1863, and later the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery everywhere in the United States in 1865. That same year, the Freedmen's Bureau was established to coordinate efforts to help African Americans in their transition to freedom. Then, there were some setbacks with presidential Reconstruction, as Johnson, in his rush to readmit seceded states, allowed states to introduce black codes, which severely suppressed the rights of former slaves. As radical Republicans approved their congressional plans for Reconstruction, the South was militarized, and states were no longer allowed to suppress the rights of former slaves. African Americans gained civil and political rights, first with the Civil Rights Act, and then through the passage of the 14th Amendment, which gave them citizenship and citizenship rights, and the 15th Amendment, which secured voting rights for them. As Reconstruction suddenly ended in 1877, the gains of the past were reversed, and African Americans were deprived of all of their rights. Black codes were reintroduced, voting restrictions set in place, racial segregation was legalized in all states, and supported by the Supreme Court in its Plessy v. Ferguson ruling. Economically, African Americans were systemically denied opportunities and were trapped in a system of sharecropping and debt peonage. Additionally, many communities in the South faced anti-black violence and lynchings. The New South. During Reconstruction, the South's economy recovered from the destruction left by the Civil War and was completely transformed. The South diversified its economy by growing different types of crops and increasing its industrial output, although it never rivaled the North's production. Its industry grew tremendously after the war. The new prosperity of the South, however, never reached African Americans. Black codes. After Reconstruction, state governments in the South reintroduced black codes, laws based on older slave codes, severely restricting the civil and political rights of African Americans. Black codes varied from state to state. Generally, black codes regulated black marriages, regulated labor contracts between whites and freedmen, and made it illegal for black men to travel freely. Black men could not leave their jobs and were required to show that they had worked during the current year. Black men could be whipped for showing disrespect to their employers. Additionally, black men could not vote. Black men could not serve as jurors in a court of law. Black men could not testify in court against a white person. Black men could not hold any government office. Black men could not serve in the state militia. As you can see, state laws were extremely unfavorable to African Americans, and were especially designed to keep them from exercising their civil and political rights. Sharecropping. African Americans were desperate to find the means to earn a living, while plantation owners needed labor to continue production. These two variables created an economic system that trapped African Americans into a form of servitude that resembled the conditions suffered during slavery. Plantation owners entered into sharecropping arrangements with their former slaves. Landowners provided a cabin, a mule, tools, and land, while the former slave, turned into a sharecropper, had to give a large share of their crop in return as payment. Contracts often had favorable clauses and conditions for the landowner, and nothing but difficult obligations and disadvantages for the African American sharecropper. Debt peonage. Debt peonage became a trap for African Americans. Many sharecroppers accumulated large debts, usually owed to their landowner. Former slaves were not free to leave the plantation until the debt was paid in full. This arrangement tied the freedman down to his work in the plantation. Debts continued to pile up, and the freedman and his family had no real chance of ever leaving the plantation. Debt peonage perpetuated a circle of poverty. Sharecropper receives seeds and land in exchange for promising to give half of the crop to the landowner at the time of harvest. The sharecropper buys food and clothes from the landowner's store on credit, and often at high prices. The sharecropper works hard in the fields until the crop is ready for harvest. The sharecropper gives the landowner the crop to sell. The sharecropper gets half of the crop minus his debts. After having sold the crop, the landowner says that the sharecropper owes him more than what he has earned. To pay his debt, the sharecropper promises a greater share of the crop during the next harvest. The sharecropper is tied to the plantation until the debt is paid in full. Under the current arrangements, it is extremely difficult for the sharecropper to pay his debt. He will continue to work in the plantation with no hope of ever leaving. As you can see, the lives of African Americans in the rural South changed very little, and the new generations had lives that pretty much resembled the lives of their parents or grandparents who had worked on the plantations as slaves. The end of Reconstruction. The end of Reconstruction left a legacy of racism and segregation under the Jim Crow legal system, the economic dependency of African Americans as indebted sharecroppers, the lack of education and political experience of African Americans. Terrorism and anti-black violence became a common way to intimidate African Americans. The federal government lost all interest in Southern Reconstruction and withdrew from the South after an economic collapse and disputed presidential election. While some African American families began migrating to the North, the families that did stay in the South responded to oppression and violence by forming strong and tight communities centered around their church. After Reconstruction, all the hopes and promises of emancipation and equality were gone. For many decades, African Americans suffered ongoing discrimination, segregation in public places and facilities, systemic violence, intimidation, oppression, and the denial of their most basic rights. African Americans were denied economic opportunities and for the most part remained poor, uneducated, underpaid, exploited, and with dashed hopes of a better future.